There is a hat, a simple straw hat, faded by sun and salt, that has traveled farther than almost any object in One Piece world. It was worn by a man who conquered the Grand Line and by a boy who dreamed of doing the same. It has survived storms, battles, and more than 20 years, carrying beneath its brim the quiet outline of every promise that matters in this story. Tonight, we follow that hat back to where it began, to a small village in the East Blue, to a boy too young to understand what he was asking for, and to a man who gave him the one thing he could not truly afford to give away. Subscribe here if you would like more calm One Piece stories. We begin, as this story always begins, in Foosha Village. Foosha Village sits on the coast of the East Blue, a quiet windmill-dotted stretch of land far from the more dangerous seas that pirates spend their lives sailing through. It is the kind of place where nothing much happens, where the biggest excitement in a given month might be a merchant ship passing offshore or a particularly good catch pulled in by the local fishermen. It is not the kind of place where legends are supposed to be born. And yet it was here, more than 20 years before the story most people know begins, that a ship flying a red flag dropped anchor in the harbor, and a group of pirates climbed off it, laughing. And one of them, a young man with untidy black hair and 3 faint scars over his left eye, walked into a small bar and ordered a drink like he had done it 100 times before in 100 different ports. His name was Shanks, and though almost no one in Foosha Village knew it yet, he had already lived a life that most sailors could not have imagined for themselves. Shanks had grown up on the sea in the truest sense of that phrase. As a boy he had served as a cabin hand aboard the Oro Jackson, the ship of Gold D. Roger, the man who would go on to become the Pirate King. He had scrubbed decks and run errands, and absorbed, simply by being present, the atmosphere of a crew that was in the process of becoming the most famous pirates the world had ever known. He served alongside another cabin boy, a loud, theatrical young man named Buggy, and the two of them, despite constant bickering that would follow them for the rest of their lives, grew up under the same sky, learning the same lessons from the same extraordinary captain. When Roger's journey ended, when the age that Roger had built with his own hands closed and the age of pirates that his final words ignited began, Shanks was one of the many young sailors who had to decide what to do with everything they had learned. He formed his own crew. He named himself after the color of his hair. And he began sailing the world with an easy confidence that made it seem to anyone watching like he had never once doubted where he was going. By the time Shanks's ship anchored in Foosha Village, he was already becoming known in certain circles, not yet the towering figure he would eventually be, but a captain whose name carried a particular kind of weight among people who paid attention to the sea. He and his crew stayed in the village for what would end up being an extended, unhurried visit, drinking at the local bar, getting to know the townspeople, settling into the specific rhythm of a small coastal community, the way sailors sometimes do when they find a port that feels, for whatever reason, worth lingering in. The bar they frequented was run by a young woman named Makino, kind and steady and endlessly patient with the noise and mess that a crew of pirates inevitably brought with them. And it was in that bar, among the barrels and the laughter and the smell of the sea drifting in through the open door, that Shanks first met a small boy who would not leave him alone. Monkey D. Luffy was 7 years old, and he had decided, with the complete and uncomplicated certainty that only a 7-year-old can summon that Shanks and his crew were the most incredible people he had ever encountered. He followed them everywhere. He asked endless questions about the sea and about pirates, and about what it felt like to sail somewhere no one had ever been. He wanted more than he had ever wanted anything, to join their crew and sail away with them that very day. Shanks, for his part, found the boy amusing in the particular way that adults find children amusing when the children have not yet learned to be careful about what they say out loud. He refused Luffy's requests to join the crew, not unkindly but firmly, telling him again and again that he was too young, that pirating was a dangerous life, that a 7-year-old boy belonged in his village with the people who loved him rather than on the open sea with a crew of hardened sailors. Luffy did not accept this answer gracefully. He never really has accepted disappointing answers gracefully. But underneath the frustration, something else was happening. Luffy was watching Shanks the way small children sometimes watch the adults who will end up shaping the rest of their lives, absorbing details he could not yet articulate, forming an attachment that would outlast every argument and every year of separation that was still to come. It was during this extended stay that the incident with the devil fruit occurred, and it is worth telling slowly because it is the moment that quietly determined the shape of everything that followed. Shanks's crew had, at some point in their travels, come into possession of a strange fruit, swirled and unusual in appearance, kept in a chest aboard their ship. It was a devil fruit, though no one in the crew seemed to have identified exactly which one, and Shanks had intended to hold on to it, perhaps to sell it. Perhaps simply because a captain does not casually discard something that unusual without understanding what it does first. Luffy found it. He did not know what a devil fruit was in any meaningful sense. He simply saw a strange piece of food sitting where food should not have been sitting, and being a 7-year-old boy with a 7-year-old boy's relationship to hunger and curiosity, he ate it. It tasted terrible by every account he has ever given of the moment. But it was already done. He had eaten the Gomu Gomu no Mi, and his body, from that point forward, would have the properties of rubber. He would stretch and bend and snap back into shape in ways that no ordinary human body could. He would also, and this detail would matter enormously in the very near future, permanently lose the ability to swim, because devil fruit users are, without exception, rendered helpless in open water, the sea itself rejecting them the moment they gain their strange new power. Shanks was furious, or at least performed fury in the exaggerated way that adults sometimes do with children, informing Luffy that he had just eaten a devil fruit and would never be able to swim again as a result. Luffy, delighted rather than chastened, decided this was an even trade, because now his arms could stretch, and that seemed to a 7-year-old like an extraordinarily good deal. It is a small, almost comic moment in the larger arc of their story. But it is also the origin point of everything Luffy would eventually become, the rubber body that would carry him through storms and battles and years at sea, acquired by pure accident in the back room of a small village bar, because a boy who wanted to be a pirate could not wait for permission to start becoming one. The bar itself was the site of another important moment, this one darker and less forgiving than the story of the fruit. A group of mountain bandits, led by a large and cruel man named Higuma, had a habit of passing through Foosha Village and treating its people with contempt. One evening in Makino's bar, Higuma and his men grew belligerent, and in a moment of casual cruelty, Higuma poured a mug of alcohol over Shanks's head in front of the entire room. It was an insult, deliberate and public, the kind of thing that in most pirate stories would be answered immediately with violence. Shanks did not respond. He simply sat there dripping and let the moment pass without retaliation. To the bandits, this looked like cowardice, and they left the bar laughing at the pirate captain who had let himself be humiliated without lifting a hand. To Luffy, watching from nearby, it looked like something worse than cowardice. It looked like a betrayal of everything he had believed about who Shanks was. He confronted Shanks about it directly, asking him why he hadn't fought back, telling him that he thought Shanks was supposed to be strong. Shanks's answer was quiet, and it would take Luffy years to fully understand it. Something about how real strength does not need to prove itself in every room it enters, about how a captain who is responsible for a crew and a village does not throw away that responsibility over a spilled drink and a wounded ego. Luffy did not understand it that night. He was angry and disappointed, and in the specific wounded way of a child whose hero has just seemed smaller than expected, quietly heartbroken. The story might have simply continued from there, an unresolved disagreement between a boy and the pirate he admired, if Higuma had not returned. Sometime later, Higuma encountered Luffy alone, and in an act of casual, senseless cruelty, decided to make the boy pay for the embarrassment of the earlier confrontation, dragging him off and eventually throwing him into the sea. And this is where the earlier accident, the fruit eaten in a moment of hunger and curiosity, became something far more dangerous than a party trick. Luffy could not swim. His body, rubber now and permanently rejected by the ocean around it, began to sink helpless, unable to do anything to save himself. And as if the moment needed to be made even more dire, a sea king, one of the massive ancient creatures that patrol the waters of the East Blue, surfaced nearby and moved toward the drowning boy with the simple, terrible intention of eating him. Shanks arrived in time. He dove into the water, pulled Luffy free, and placed himself between the boy and the Sea King, and in the confrontation that followed, he lost his left arm. There is no dramatic battle to describe here, no clever strategy or a clash of blades. The Sea King simply took it, and Shanks let it happen, because the alternative was letting the creature take Luffy instead, and that was never, in any version of the calculation Shanks made in that moment, an option he was willing to consider. He drove the creature off, according to most accounts, through sheer force of will and presence rather than any weapon, and he carried Luffy back to shore, bleeding, missing an arm that would never grow back, and he did not, in any account that has ever been given of the moment, seem to regret the trade even slightly. Higuma did not survive the encounter either. What happened to him afterward has never been dwelt upon at length in any telling of this story, and it is enough to say that the bandits who had terrorized Foosha Village were never seen there again, and the village returned, in the following weeks, to something like its ordinary rhythm, except that one of its pirate visitors was now missing an arm, and one of its children had begun to understand, in a way he had not understood before, what it actually meant to be protected by someone. Shanks and his crew remained in Foosha Village for a while longer after that, recovering, settling their remaining business, And then the day arrived, as it always eventually does in stories like this one, when they had to leave. Luffy came to the harbor to say goodbye, and it was there, in the last moments before the ship pulled away, that he made his declaration, loud and unembarrassed and completely sincere, that he was going to become a pirate too, that he was going to gather his own crew and sail out onto the same sea Shanks sailed, and that someday he was going to surpass him. It is worth pausing on how young Luffy was when he said this, because there is nothing about the promise that reads as childish exaggeration in hindsight. He meant it exactly as literally as it sounds, and he has spent every year since attempting to make it true. Shanks's response to this declaration is the moment that the entire story eventually pivots around, though nobody standing on that pier could have known it at the time. He took off his straw hat, the hat that had been given to him years earlier by Goldie Roger himself during his time on the Oro Jackson, a hat that carried within it the weight of Shanks's entire history, his apprenticeship under the Pirate King, his own hard-won identity as a captain, everything he had built and everything he had lost along the way, including, quite recently, an arm. He placed it on Luffy's head. He told him to take good care of it, that it was a very important hat to him, and that Luffy should return it to him someday, once he had become a great pirate in his own right. It was not framed as a gift in the way gifts are usually framed. It was framed as a promise, a specific binding arrangement between a man and a small boy standing on a pier, the terms of which required nothing less than Luffy becoming exactly what he had just declared he would become. The ship pulled away from the harbor, and Luffy stood on the pier crying, the too large hat slipping down over his eyes, and he made a vow that morning that would define every choice he made for the rest of his life. He would grow up, he would build a crew, he would sail out past the borders of everything he currently knew, and someday, somewhere out on the wide, unknowable sea, he would find Shanks again and place the hat back on his head, not as a returned object but as proof, undeniable, and finally spoken aloud, that he had kept his promise. The years that followed were quiet ones, at least in the sense that nothing about them made it into the wider world's awareness the way the story eventually would. Luffy grew up in Foosha Village and the surrounding area, raised in large part by Makino and looked after, in his grandfather Garp's characteristically brutal fashion, by occasional visits from the old Marine who was determined to make a soldier out of him and consistently failed. He met Portgas, D. Ace, and Sabo during these years, two boys who would become his brothers in every sense that mattered, bound together not by blood, but by shared meals and shared dreams, and the particular intensity of childhood friendships formed in a place with very little else to occupy the time. He trained. He got into trouble. He wore the straw hat constantly, protecting it with a seriousness that seemed almost comic, given how carelessly he treated almost everything else in his life, because on some level he understood, even as a child, that this particular object was not replaceable. At 17, Luffy set out to sea. He left Foosha Village in a small boat with almost nothing besides the hat on his head and the absolute, unshakable conviction that he was going to become the Pirate King. What followed is the story that most people who know anything about One Piece are already familiar with in broad strokes. The gathering of a crew, one improbable friendship after another, each new companion drawn into Luffy's orbit with the same easy, unquestioning acceptance that Shanks himself had once shown him. though Luffy would likely never describe it in those terms. Zoro, the swordsman with his own promise to keep. Nami, the navigator who had her own reasons for distrusting pirates until she met one who made her reconsider. Usopp, whose father, as it happens, sailed with Shanks himself as a sniper, a detail that connects Luffy's crew back to Shanks's in ways that go beyond the hat alone. Sanji, Chopper, Robin, Frankie, Brook, Chijinbe, each one arriving in their own time, each one choosing, for reasons specific to their own histories, to follow a captain who led with the same combination of recklessness and absolute loyalty that Shanks had shown him on that pier all those years ago. While Luffy was building his crew and working his way through the East Blue and into the Grand Line, Shanks was living an entirely different kind of life, one that was unfolding on a scale that Luffy, in those early years, had no real awareness of. Shanks had, in the time since Foosha Village, become one of the 4 emperors. The Yonko, the small handful of pirates whose individual power and influence was large enough to functionally divide the New World among them. This was not a small accomplishment. It placed him, in terms of raw significance to the world's balance of power, in the same conversation as figures like Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom, men and women who commanded fleets and territories, and who were treated by the world government not as criminals to be casually apprehended, but as forces of nature to be carefully managed. Shanks achieved this status while maintaining a reputation that was, by the standards of the New World's other major powers, unusually restrained. He was known for negotiation as often as for combat, for a diplomatic instinct that allowed him to diffuse conflicts other emperors would have escalated, and for a personal code that seemed to prioritize stability over conquest in a way that set him apart from almost everyone else at his level of power. His crew, the Red Hair Pirates, reflected this same character. Ben Beckman, his first mate, served as a steady, watchful counterweight to Shanks's more impulsive tendencies, a sniper and strategist whose calm presence anchored the crew through decades of dangerous water. Lucky Roo, enormous and perpetually eating, and Yasopp, the sharpshooter, whose son Usopp would grow up idolizing him from across an ocean without ever really knowing what his father's life at sea actually looked like. These were not simply Shanks's subordinates. They were the people who had watched him lose an arm to a sea king in a small village nobody had ever heard of, and who had, in the years since, helped him build something significant enough that the world eventually had no choice but to notice. The most consequential moment of Shanks's adult life, at least as far as the wider story is concerned, arrived during the war at Marineford, the battle that erupted when the world government moved to publicly execute Portgas D. Ace, the same Ace who had grown up alongside Luffy as one of his sworn brothers. The war that followed was one of the largest and most devastating conflicts the story has ever depicted, drawing in Whitebeard's entire crew, the full might of the Marine headquarters, the warlords of the sea, and eventually Luffy himself, who arrived in the middle of the chaos with the singular, desperate goal of saving his brother. The war did not end the way Luffy needed it to. Ace died in the final moments, struck down protecting Luffy from an attack meant for him, and Whitebeard, gravely wounded, defending his own crew and the honor of a battle he had already effectively won, died shortly after on the same battlefield, his passing marking the symbolic end of an entire era. It was into the aftermath of this devastation, with the battlefield still smoking and both sides exhausted past the point of continuing, that Shanks arrived. He did not come to fight. He came, by every account the story has given of the moment, to end the war before it could claim any more lives, positioning himself and his crew between the remaining combatants and making clear, through presence alone, that further fighting was not going to be permitted to continue. He spoke directly with Fleet Admiral Sengoku, and the two of them negotiated a ceasefire that neither side had been able to reach on its own, a moment that demonstrated with total clarity just how significant Shanks's standing in the world truly was. He was a man whose word could stop a war that had already claimed the lives of a legendary captain and one of the era's most promising young pirates, a man whose simple arrival on a battlefield was enough to make even a fleet admiral pause and listen. There is a smaller, quieter detail from this same period that matters just as much as the ceasefire itself. Shanks made his way to where Luffy lay, devastated and unconscious in the aftermath of losing his brother, and he did something that has never been fully explained within the story, but has been felt by every reader who has encountered it. He stood over the boy he had once given his hat to, now a young man broken by grief on the deck of a battlefield, and, by most interpretations of the moment, he offered a kind of protection, a presence that ensured Luffy would be able to grieve and heal without further threat, before disappearing again into the vastness of the sea he had always belonged to. It was not a reunion in any of the ways Luffy had once imagined a reunion might unfold. There was no exchange of the hat, no triumphant declaration that the promise had finally been fulfilled. It was something quieter and, in its own way, sadder, a man watching over a boy who was not yet ready to become the pirate he had promised to become, choosing to wait rather than to intrude on a moment that belonged entirely to Luffy's grief. In the years that followed Marineford, as Luffy trained under Silver's Rayleigh, Roger's own former first mate, and eventually returned to sea with a crew rebuilt and a resolve hardened by everything he had lost, Shanks continued his own work in the shadows of the world's larger conflicts. He has been shown in scattered and carefully placed moments throughout the story, meeting with figures at the absolute center of the world's power structure, including conversations that appear to place him in direct, ongoing contact with the five elders themselves, the shadowy figures who govern the world government from behind him, the mysterious ruler seated above even them. What exactly Shanks discusses in these meetings, what arrangements he has made, or what information he has traded, remains one of the story's more carefully guarded mysteries. What is clear is that Shanks operates with a level of political awareness and influence that goes far beyond what most pirates, even other emperors, seem to possess. He is playing a longer game than almost anyone else in the story appears to be playing, and the shape of that game has still not been fully revealed. The sword Shanks carries, Griffin, is one of the 12 supreme-grade blades in the entire world, a weapon of significance that places it among the rarest and most powerful swords in existence, and it is worth noting, in the quiet way the story tends to note important things, that a man who fights with a single arm and rarely draws his sword at all still commands enough respect and enough raw ability that almost no one in the New World considers challenging him lightly. This is, in its way, consistent with everything else about Shanks. He does not need to prove his strength constantly. He proved it once in a small village, giving up an arm for a boy he barely knew, and he has spent every year since simply being exactly as strong as that moment suggested he was, without needing to demonstrate it again and again for an audience. The story of Luffy and Shanks did not end with Marineford, and it has not, even now, reached its conclusion. As Luffy's journey has carried him and his crew deeper into the New World, through Wano and Egghead, and finally toward Elbaf, the legendary land of the giants that the story teased from its very earliest chapters, the paths of the two of them have continued to move in parallel without quite crossing. Elbaf itself carries a particular weight in this story because Shanks has long been connected to the giants in ways the wider story has only recently begun to explain, and as Luffy and his crew have finally arrived on that fabled island, Shanks has been present there too, watching, waiting, deliberately keeping his distance from the boy who once promised to return his hat. It is a strange, aching kind of closeness, the two of them occupying the same island, the same unfolding chapter of history, without yet standing face to face. Whether that has changed, whether the moment Luffy has been building toward since he was 7 years old has finally arrived by the time you're hearing this, is something the story itself is still in the process of deciding, chapter by chapter, in real time, alongside everyone who has ever cared about that hat. What makes this story worth telling slowly, worth returning to again and again the way we have tonight, is not simply the scale of it, the emperors and the wars and the political intrigue that surrounds two of the most powerful figures in this entire world. It is the smallness at the center of it, the fact that all of this, the years of separation, the battles fought on opposite sides of the world, the quiet political maneuvering at the highest levels of power, all of it traces back to a boy who wanted to be a pirate and a man who let him keep a hat. Shanks did not know, standing on that pier in Foosha Village with one less arm than he'd had a few weeks earlier, that he was setting in motion the journey of the person who might eventually become exactly what Luffy always said he would become. He simply knew that the boy in front of him deserved something to hold on to, some tangible proof that the promise between them was real, and he gave him the most important object he owned without a second thought. There is a version of this story, and perhaps it is the truest version, in which the significance of the hat was never really about what it represented, the connection to Roger, the history of the Red Hair Pirates, the weight of everything Shanks had built. It was always simply about the fact that someone believed in Luffy before Luffy had done anything at all to earn that belief. He was 7 years old. He had not sailed anywhere. He had not fought anyone. He had eaten a fruit by accident and cried on a pier and declared, with total unearned confidence, that he was going to become the greatest pirate who had ever lived. And a man who had already lived enough of a life to know how rarely that kind of confidence turns out to be justified, looked at him anyway and decided to bet on him, decided to hand over the one object that mattered most, and trust that someday, somehow, it would find its way back. That is the story of Luffy and Shanks. It is a story about a hat, and it is a story about an arm given up without hesitation. And underneath both of those things, it is a story about what it means to believe in someone before the world has given you any real reason to. Somewhere out on the sea tonight, in the world this story belongs to, that hat is still traveling, still being worn, still waiting for the moment when it finally gets to go home. And somewhere in your own life, if you think about it quietly enough as you drift towards sleep, there is probably a version of that same belief, someone who looked at you before you had proven anything and decided you were worth trusting anyway. That is not a small thing. It has never been a small thing. It is, If this story has taught us anything at all, one of the most important things there is. Before Shanks was red-haired Shanks, before he had a crew or a reputation or an empire's worth of respect built up across the New World, he was simply a cabin boy, one of the youngest and least significant people aboard the Oro Jackson, the ship that carried Goldie Roger toward the very end of the Grand Line. He was not given this position because anyone believed he was destined for greatness. He was given it, as far as anyone has ever explained, because he was a boy who wanted badly enough to be at sea that someone eventually let him stay. He scrubbed decks. He carried supplies. He listened, mostly in silence, to conversations between men who were in the process of making history without fully realizing it yet, because history rarely announces itself while it is happening. Beside him, sharing the same chores and the same cramped sleeping quarters, was another boy, loud where Shanks was quiet, dramatic where Shanks was steady. A boy named Buggy who wanted, with an intensity that matched Shanks's own, to matter to the crew he had found himself serving. The two of them did not get along, not in any easy sense. They argued constantly over chores and attention and the small, meaningless competitions that boys invent when they are young and unsure of their place in a world too large for them. But there is a story from those years, one that the crew of the Oro Jackson apparently retold for years afterward with a particular kind of fondness that mirrors something you may recognize if you were listening the last time we spoke. The two boys found a strange, unusual piece of fruit stored among the ship's more mysterious cargo, and in the middle of one of their arguments, wrestling over who would get to keep it or eat it or simply hold it, the fruit ended up in Buggy's mouth by accident. It was a devil fruit, the Barabara no Mi, and Buggy's body would carry the consequences of that argument for the rest of his life, split apart and rejoined at will, and permanently unable to swim, exactly the same permanent cost that Luffy would pay decades later for his own accidental meal. It is a strange thing to sit with, the idea that the two most significant relationships of Shanks's early life, the rival he grew up beside, and the boy he would later hand his hat to, were both shaped by the same accident happening twice, 40 years apart, on two different ships, in two different corners of the world. Neither Buggy nor Luffy set out to become what they became. Both of them simply reached for something that looked interesting and changed the entire shape of their lives without meaning to. Roger noticed both boys in his own characteristically unpredictable way. He did not treat them as future legends. He treated them by every account the way a captain treats children who happen to be underfoot on his ship, with a mixture of amusement and mild exasperation, and underneath both of those things, a genuine and closely guarded fondness. Silvers Rayleigh, Roger's first mate, took a more active hand in shaping them, teaching them the basics of swordsmanship and seamanship, with the patience of a man who understood, better than almost anyone alive, what it meant to be young and unformed in the presence of greatness. It was on this ship, watching Roger make decisions that would eventually be studied and mythologized for centuries, that Shanks first absorbed the particular philosophy that would define his own captaincy years later, the idea that a crew is not built through fear or dominance, but through something closer to trust, freely given and rarely betrayed. When Roger's illness became impossible to hide any longer, when the crew understood that their captain did not have much time left, Roger made a decision that shocked almost everyone who sailed with him. He disbanded the crew, He did not ask them to stay by his side until the end. He sent them away, out into the world, each of them carrying a piece of everything he had taught them, rather than keeping them gathered around him for a final sentimental farewell. It was, by every interpretation the story has offered since, an act of profound generosity disguised as something colder, a captain making sure that the people who had given him their loyalty would not be forced to watch him die, that they would instead be given the chance to go build something of their own with what he had given them. Shanks was among those sent away. He would not be present by most accounts for the execution at Logtown, the moment when Roger walked to the platform and spoke the words that set the entire age of pirates into motion. He heard about it the way most of the world eventually heard about it, secondhand, the story arriving faster than any single ship could carry it, spreading across oceans the way important things always seem to. What Shanks carried away from those years was not simply skill with a blade or knowledge of the sea, though he carried plenty of both. He carried a specific understanding of what it meant to be trusted by someone whose trust was not easily earned, and he carried, perhaps most importantly, the straw hat itself, given to him by Roger at some point during those final years, in circumstances the story has never fully detailed. It was already, by the time Shanks became a captain in his own right, an object with a history far longer than most swords or treasures a young pirate might carry. And when he eventually placed it on a 7-year-old boy's head in a small village on the edge of the East Blue, he was not simply giving away a hat. He was continuing a chain of trust that had already passed through at least 2 hands before his, from Roger to himself, and from himself eventually to Luffy. The crew Shanks built in the years after Roger's death reflected everything he had absorbed aboard the Oro Jackson. Ben Beckman became his first mate, and the relationship between the two of them is one of the quieter, steadier partnerships in the entire story, built not on drama, but on a kind of unspoken competence, Beckman functioning as the voice of caution that balanced Shanks' own instinct toward risk. Lucky Roo, enormous and perpetually eating, and Yasopp, whose marksmanship was matched only by the warmth he apparently carried for a family he had left behind in a small village in the East Blue, a wife and a son he would not see again for years at a time, choosing the sea over the quiet life he might otherwise have had. Yasopp's son, a boy named Usopp, grew up in that same village hearing stories about his father's adventures, embellishing them further in the telling and retelling, dreaming of becoming a brave warrior of the sea himself, long before he understood what that dream would eventually cost or require of him. There is a quiet symmetry here worth noticing. The same crew that once anchored in Foosha Village and changed the course of one boy's life had, without anyone fully realizing it at the time, already shaped a second boy's dreams from a distance, through a father's letters and a father's absence, and the specific ache of growing up admiring someone you rarely get to see. The Red Hair Pirates, under Shanks's captaincy, developed a reputation across the years that set them apart from most of the other powerful crews sailing the same waters. They fought when fighting was necessary, and they were, by every account, formidable when they did. But Shanks's crew became known, more than almost any other crew at their level of power, for restraint, for a willingness to walk away from conflicts that other captains would have escalated without hesitation. This reputation was not built on weakness. It was built on the opposite of weakness, on a confidence so complete that Shanks rarely felt the need to prove it through unnecessary violence. He became an emperor of the sea, one of the four pirates whose combined strength and influence effectively governed the balance of power across the New World, and he did it while maintaining a personal philosophy that many of his fellow emperors would have found almost incomprehensible: the belief that the era of pirates he had been born into needed, above almost anything else, to be protected from destroying itself. This belief brought him, on more than one occasion, into direct contact with Whitebeard, the man widely considered the strongest pirate alive during those years, the captain who had built his own crew into something closer to a family than a fighting force. There is a moment from the years before Ace's death that the story returns to with particular tenderness. A visit Shanks paid to Whitebeard's ship, the two of them sharing drinks together in a scene that carried none of the tension you might expect between two men of their stature. They spoke, according to what has been shown of the conversation, about the passage of time, about how the era both of them had helped build was beginning, slowly and unmistakably, to change shape beneath them. Shanks brought a warning with him that day about a member of Whitebeard's own crew, a quiet, unremarkable man named Marshall D. Teach, who Shanks believed was becoming something far more dangerous than his current position suggested. Whitebeard, by his own admission in the scene, dismissed the warning, not out of arrogance exactly, but out of the specific, stubborn loyalty of a captain who did not believe any member of his family capable of the betrayal Shanks was describing. It would turn out, in the months that followed, that Shanks had been entirely correct, and the cost of that misplaced trust would eventually ripple outward into one of the most devastating chapters in the entire story. When the war at Marineford finally erupted, when Ace's execution triggered a conflict that drew in the full might of the Marines and the desperate, grieving fury of Whitebeard's entire crew, Marshall D. Teach was there too, though not on Whitebeard's side. He had already left the crew by then, had already begun assembling his own following, and in the chaos of the battle's final moments after Whitebeard had fallen, Teach appeared on the battlefield and, in an act that confirmed everything Shanks had once tried to warn against, stole the deceased captain's devil fruit power for himself, adding it to abilities he already should not have been able to possess at all. It was in the immediate aftermath of this, with the battlefield still raw, and the war technically over, but the danger far from settled, that Shanks arrived, and it is worth telling this part of the story slowly, because it says something significant about how the world actually measures power in this story. Blackbeard, standing amid the wreckage of a war he had just profited enormously from, found himself facing Shanks directly, and rather than press whatever advantage he believed his newly stolen power might have given him, he chose to retreat. He gathered his men and withdrew from the battlefield rather than test himself against a man who had not even drawn his sword. This single decision, more than almost any battle actually shown in the story, communicated the scale of the reputation Shanks had built over the years. Here was a man who had just killed one of the most powerful pirates alive and stolen his power in the process, a man who feared almost nothing, and the mere presence of Shanks, unarmed and calm, was enough to make him choose caution over confrontation. It is the kind of detail that rewards patience, a single quiet decision on a smoking battlefield that tells you more about a person's true standing in this world than 100 pages of battle ever could. Shanks's negotiation with Fleet Admiral Sengoku followed shortly after, the conversation that finally brought the war to its official close, and the consequences of that day rippled outward through the Marine organization for years afterward. Sengoku stepped down from his position not long after. The three admirals who had led the Marine forces at Marineford found their futures reshaped by what had happened, Sakazuki and Kuzan eventually facing off against each other in a personal duel to determine who would rise to fill the vacant seat of Fleet Admiral, a fight so destructive it permanently altered the geography of the island where it took place. Kuzan lost and chose in the aftermath to leave the Marines altogether, unable to reconcile himself any longer with an institution whose direction he no longer believed in. Sakazuki became Fleet Admiral, and under his leadership the Marines grew harsher, more willing to treat every pirate as an irredeemable threat rather than distinguishing, as some of his predecessors occasionally had, between the different kinds of people who chose to sail under a Jolly Roger. None of this happened because Shanks intended it to. He came to end a war, not to reshape an institution. But the scale of his influence was large enough that even his smallest interventions sent consequences rippling outward for years. There is a quieter thread running alongside all of this, one that concerns Buggy, the boy who had once wrestled Shanks over a piece of fruit on the deck of the Oro Jackson. Buggy's path after Roger's death looked, for a very long time, nothing like Shanks's. He became a pirate known more for theatrics and misfortune than for any real threat, his crew treating him with a strange mixture of loyalty and barely concealed disbelief in his competence, his bounty rising and falling based more on circumstance than any deliberate campaign of conquest. And yet, in the years following Marineford, through a sequence of events that even Buggy himself seemed bewildered by, he found himself elevated into a position of significant power, eventually becoming recognized as one of the new emperors of the sea following the deaths and disappearances that reshaped the balance of power in the New World. It is difficult not to smile at this particular turn of the story. The boy who accidentally ate a devil fruit while fighting with Shanks over a piece of food now sits decades later at the same table Shanks has occupied for years, an emperor in his own right, however unlikely the path that carried him there. Whatever rivalry or affection still exists between the two of them, shaped by decades of separation and wildly divergent fortunes, they remain connected by a shared childhood that neither of them has ever fully spoken about in front of the wider world. There is one more thread worth following before we let this story rest for the night, and it concerns the giants of Elbaf, the island the Straw Hats have finally reached after more than 20 years of anticipation, stretching all the way back to a passing mention in the earliest arcs of the series. Shanks's connection to Elbaf runs deeper than almost anyone outside his own crew has ever fully understood, and the story has only recently begun drawing back the curtain on what that connection actually involves. He is known there, respected there, in ways that suggest a history far longer and more complicated than a simple alliance between a pirate crew and a nation of warriors. There are theories circulated widely among people who study this story closely, suggesting that a version of Shanks, or perhaps someone who deliberately resembles him, may be connected to events in Elbaf's more recent history that Shanks himself has not yet been forced to answer for directly. This remains, as of the story's current chapter, a theory rather than a confirmed fact, the kind of thread Oda has planted and left carefully unresolved the way he has planted so many other mysteries across the decades, trusting that the answer will arrive exactly when it needs to and not a moment before. What is confirmed, what the story has shown plainly, is that Shanks has been present on or near Elbaf for some time, watching the Straw Hat's arrival with a deliberateness that suggests he is choosing, very carefully, when and how he allows himself to be seen. He has been shown observing Luffy from a distance, aware of exactly where the boy he once gave a hat to has ended up, and choosing, for reasons the story has not yet fully explained, to keep himself just out of reach. It is a strange kind of patience, the sort that only makes sense if you remember everything that came before it. A man who once told a crying 7-year-old to grow up before coming to find him, apparently still holding, even now, to some version of that same instruction. Luffy is no longer 7. He has done almost everything he once promised he would do, and still, the moment has not arrived. Still, the hat has not gone home. There is a smaller story worth mentioning here too, one that connects Shanks's influence to a life he likely has no idea he shaped at all. A young Marine named Kobe stood at Marineford during the war, barely more than a recruit, and watched in horror the devastation unfolding around him, the death of Whitebeard, the death of Ace, the sheer, senseless scale of the loss. In the aftermath, Kobe made a vow of his own, not to become the strongest Marine who ever lived, but to become someone capable of stopping wars like that one before they could ever begin, to use whatever power he eventually gained, not for conquest, but for the specific quiet work of preventing needless death. It is not a vow Shanks ever spoke to him directly, but it is, in its shape and its spirit, almost identical to the philosophy Shanks has carried through his entire career, the belief that real strength is measured by what you choose not to destroy rather than by what you're capable of destroying. Ideas like that do not always need to be spoken aloud to spread. Sometimes they simply live in the way a person carries themselves through a crisis, and the people who happen to be watching absorb them without ever fully realizing where the lesson came from. So here is where we leave this story tonight. Not at an ending, because this particular story does not have one yet, but at the edge of something that is still unfolding, chapter by chapter, in real time. A man who once gave away his hat on a quiet pier has spent every year since building an empire out of restraint rather than conquest, negotiating peace where other emperors would have chosen war, watching from a careful distance as the boy he believed in finally becomes everything he once promised he would become. And somewhere on the same island tonight, in the story that is still being written even as you listen to this, that boy is out there too, older now, stronger now, wearing a hat that has traveled farther than either of them could have imagined on the day it changed hands. Whatever happens next between them, whenever it finally happens, it will be the payoff of a promise made more than 20 years ago by a man who believed, without any real proof yet to justify it, that a small boy crying on a pier was worth trusting with the most important thing he owned. Thank you for drifting through this story with me again tonight. If you would like to hear more, there is another calm One Piece story waiting close by. Let it carry you the rest of the way into rest.